Becoming a Templar Knight was not about joining a group of warriors. It was about giving up your entire identity. You lost your name, your freedom, your property, and your will. So why did noblemen wait years for the chance to live under constant discipline and die before 40? Forget what you think you know about medieval knighthood. This was not some casual fighting club where you showed up with a sword and called yourself a soldier of God. The Templars were selective to the point of obsession. Most boys who hoped to wear that famous white cloak with the red cross began their training around the age of 13 or 14. But here was the problem. Not just anyone could apply. You needed noble birth, strong family ties, and preferably a large fortune backing your name. Even then, rich parents could not simply buy your way in. The vetting process made modern job interviews look like a picnic. First came an interrogation by senior Templars who asked questions that cut straight to your soul. They wanted every detail about your ancestry, your debts, your health, and whether you had ever been married. Some boys tried to hide wives or lovers back home. Bad idea. The Templars had ways of discovering secrets, and those caught lying were sent home in disgrace. But if you passed their scrutiny, the real ordeal began. You had to swear 3 sacred vows that stripped away almost every human comfort. A vow of poverty meant giving up all wealth and possessions forever. The vow of chastity required complete abstinence from love or desire. No flirtations, no touching, not even a friendly hug. The vow of obedience bound you completely to your commander's will. If he ordered you to clean floors with your bare hands, you did it without question. After the oaths came the initiation ceremony. It was intense, humiliating, and spiritual all at once. Veterans watched closely as new recruits proved their loyalty through long prayers and symbolic acts of surrender. Some young men broke down, unable to take the pressure. Those who stayed began training immediately. Combat lessons were grueling. You trained with sword, lance, and shield until your muscles screamed. You also learned how to care for your warhorse, a massive animal that cost more than most homes. If the horse needed feeding while you were exhausted, too bad. The horse came first. Prayer ruled your life. There were prayers before sunrise, at noon, at dusk, and again in the dead of night. Your knees became bruised and hardened from kneeling so often. And you memorized rule after rule, hundreds of them, covering everything from table manners to cleaning your weapons. Few made it through the spiritual and physical trial. Out of every 100 applicants, maybe 5 received the white cloak of the Templars. The rest returned home defeated, probably relieved they no longer had to wake up before dawn every day. But for those who succeeded, the real test was just beginning. Templar life ran like clockwork. Sleep, meals, prayers, and work all followed a strict schedule written in their code, known simply as the Rule. Imagine an instruction manual with hundreds of detailed laws, governing every possible part of existence. It decided when you could eat, sleep, speak, and even how long your silence should last. It was medieval micromanagement taken to divine levels. Meals were especially strict. Picture rows of armored men eating in perfect silence while one monk read scripture aloud. No chatter, no laughter, no asking for more bread. Break the silence and you faced weeks of penance. Surprisingly, many knights embraced this rigid life. These were men who could have enjoyed luxury in their family castles, but instead they chose simplicity and control. For them, discipline was freedom. After their morning meal, it was time to tend to the horses. These animals were not gentle pets. They were enormous, powerful creatures, capable of breaking bones if handled carelessly. Each knight spent hours grooming, feeding, and inspecting them. Next came weapons drills. Armor had to shine, swords had to stay sharp, and shields had to be maintained constantly. A neglected blade could cost you your life in battle. Every moment of the day was planned and supervised. Privacy did not exist. Someone was always watching to make sure the rules were obeyed. Even rest came with regulations. When to lie down, how to arrange your blanket, and how long you were allowed to sleep. Life as a Templar Knight was not glorious. It was a lifetime of duty, prayer, and exhaustion. But to those who stayed, it was also the highest honor a man could achieve. This was not a summer retreat with bedtime prayers. It was a complete overhaul of body and mind, transforming individual warriors into one synchronized force. Every movement, every breath was aligned because they had been trained that way since their first day. And speaking of that training, wait until you hear about their living conditions. The reality might shock you, and not in a pleasant way. The Templar commandery was all about practicality, not luxury. Home for a Templar Knight was far from comfortable. They lived in shared dormitories, called commanderies or preceptories, spread across Europe like a vast network of religious fortresses. Think of them as medieval barracks filled with prayer and lacking any hint of privacy. Stepping into a Templar commandery felt like entering the most disciplined camp ever built. Every object had a set place, and every person had a defined purpose. The buildings were solid, efficient, and free of decoration that might distract from faith. Each knight received a small space of his own, though calling it a room would be generous. It was usually just a narrow section with a wooden bed, a small chest for weapons and armor, and perhaps a stool. Comfort was not part of the plan. Luxury was a foreign idea to them. Compared to the Templars, today's minimalists would look like collectors. And here is the part that truly stands out. They did not even own their own blankets. Everything, down to the simplest piece of clothing, belonged to the order. The knights wore identical garments, used identical bedding, and shared nearly all possessions. It made sense, though. You could not crave what was never truly yours. At the center of every commandery stood the chapel. It was not a small annex or side room, but a full church where the knights gathered for prayer several times each day. These were mandatory gatherings. Miss a morning service because you overslept, and your punishment would involve long hours on your knees. What makes commandery life so striking is how it forced noble men to live like students in a shared dorm. They ate together at long tables, slept in the same hall, and bathed in communal areas. Privacy did not exist. Even using the latrine required permission from a superior. Meals followed the same strict pattern as everything else. A hall contained plain tables and benches, and all meals were taken in total silence while one brother read from the Bible. Try chatting in that environment. Actually, do not. You would be cleaning the floor for days. Every commandery functioned like a small self-sufficient village, complete with blacksmith shops, stables, storehouses, and offices. The knights did not just live there. They labored there as well. Scribes handled records, craftsmen repaired weapons, and everyone contributed to maintaining the property. Brotherhood among them was more than just a religious slogan. These men relied on each other for faith, food, and survival. When death could come in the next battle, trust in your companions meant everything. All that shared work and obedience forged something remarkable, a fighting force unlike anything Europe had known. Which brings us to how they managed this massive network. Running an army of thousands across continents without modern tools? It sounds impossible, but the Templars pulled it off with ruthless organization. At the very top stood the Grand Master, the ultimate authority whose word could decide the fate of nations. Beneath him were senior officers, like the Seneschal, the Marshal, and the commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Each had clear duties that kept the order operating smoothly. But the Templars were not just composed of knights in white cloaks. There were three main classes in the order, each with its own role and uniform. The full knights wore white mantles marked with red crosses, the symbol of their holy cause. The sergeants wore darker clothing, often brown or black, and carried out both combat and support tasks. The chaplains had their own attire as well, responsible for guiding the spiritual lives of their brothers. The chain of command was absolute. When a marshal issued an order, obedience was not optional. Questioning authority was viewed as defiance against God. This was not a workplace where debate was welcome. Disobedience carried real consequences. Smaller mistakes might result in fasting or extra prayer duties. Greater offenses brought harsher treatment. Spending months eating on the floor was considered a mild penalty. Some offenders lost their mantles entirely and were expelled from the order, which was social ruin in the medieval world. Every detail of life and duty was recorded. The Templars kept meticulous logs of who joined, who advanced, and who failed. Managing land, property, and men from Britain to the Holy Land demanded perfect organization. Each commandery sent reports up the chain, forming a network of information that rivaled the precision of modern institutions. What truly stands out about the Templars is how they combined absolute discipline with spiritual devotion. A single knight could command a cavalry charge before noon and spend the evening copying sacred manuscripts. The same man who operated siege machines might spend hours whispering prayers under candlelight. But here is the thing about their rigid organization. It worked flawlessly, until it did not. The Templars became so strong and independent that they functioned almost like a separate kingdom inside other kingdoms. They owed allegiance to no monarch, paid no taxes, and possessed riches that made rulers uneasy. That kind of power was a dangerous luxury. When an organization becomes wealthier and more efficient than the crown, envy begins to grow in very dark corners. To be a Templar Knight was to surrender your life to faith first, to the sword second, and to everything else last. These men were not part-time believers who showed up for weekly services. They built their entire existence around prayer, repentance, and spiritual warfare. Their daily routine was relentless. The day began with matins at 2 in the morning. While the rest of the world slept, Templars knelt in icy chapels, chanting psalms by flickering light. Then came lauds at sunrise, prime at 6, terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. That made 8 prayer sessions every single day, whether they were in a fortress in France or a dusty camp near Jerusalem. What set them apart from other warriors was their refusal to skip prayers, even during battles. Imagine explaining to an enemy cavalry that you needed to pause for a prayer break. The Templars actually arranged their battle lines so some could pray while others held defensive positions. It was faith and warfare operating in perfect rhythm. Confession was mandatory as well. Every knight was required to confess his sins regularly, from impure thoughts to cursing after stubbing a toe. The order demanded purity of mind and soul, believing divine favor depended on moral perfection. Their mission went beyond warfare. They became guardians of travelers and caretakers of the helpless. Pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land relied on Templar escorts, but the knights also aided widows, orphans, and churches in distress. They ran hospitals, distributed food during times of famine, and even settled arguments among Christian communities. However, one of their strictest rules concerned women. A Templar could not even kiss his mother or sister in farewell. Dancing, casual talk, or any form of affection was forbidden. Some believe this rule prevented emotional distraction. Others see it as medieval fear of temptation. Either way, it made family visits incredibly awkward. That red cross on their white mantle was more than decoration. It was a constant symbol of sacrifice, reminding every knight that he had vowed to die for his faith if necessary. Many saw death in battle not as tragedy, but as the ultimate expression of devotion. This level of spiritual commitment created problems of its own once faith collided with the brutal demands of war. People often imagine knights living for glory, but for Templars, glory usually came with blood and exhaustion. Death was always close. These men were not playing at knighthood. They were the armored core of Crusader armies, charging across battlefields as heavily armed cavalry. They rode massive war horses, wore mail and plate that together weighed more than 60 pounds and carried 12-foot lances along with swords blessed by priests. Their shields bore the unmistakable red cross. But owning such gear came with endless upkeep. Every dawn, they checked their armor for rust or weakness. A cracked link or a loose buckle could turn fatal in seconds. Their horses required just as much attention. These animals were enormous, powerful, and worth small fortunes. Losing one could cost a knight his life or his standing. Between battles, Templars patrolled pilgrimage routes, protecting travelers from robbers and raiders. It might sound dull, but those paths were filled with danger. They also built and maintained castles, hauling stone and armor under blazing sun. Through it all, they still observed their full prayer schedule. Imagine pausing mid-fight to recite psalms. Such was their devotion. The order even maintained its own medical staff. Battlefield injuries were unavoidable, and Templar physicians became skilled through grim necessity. They treated arrow wounds, fractures, and infections, developing techniques ahead of their time. Still, medicine could only do so much. A serious wound often meant infection and death, and if not, the cure might be amputation. Survival was rare. The truth is, most Templars did not live to old age. Many fell in battle, others to illness or disease contracted during campaigns. Those who survived faced the risk of capture, which could be worse than death. Refusing to renounce their faith or pay ransom, captured Templars were often executed immediately. To them, dying for their beliefs was the ultimate victory, even if it came at the edge of an enemy's sword. Makes sense, right? It is hard to bargain with men who have sworn to fight until their final breath. But what kept them going when the odds looked hopeless? The answer is simple. They truly believed that dying in battle earned them an instant place in heaven. To perish in God's service was not defeat. It was the highest honor. The strange twist is that their success on the battlefield made them incredibly rich. Victories brought political influence, land, and power back in Europe. Yet that same fortune would soon paint a target on their backs, as powerful people began to resent monks who lived like kings. The Templars were far more than just warriors. They became the wealthiest organization in medieval Europe, and that prosperity would eventually be their undoing. They owned vast estates, farms, ports, and even entire towns from Britain to the Holy Land. But their greatest achievement was financial innovation. They invented an early version of banking centuries before modern banks existed. Merchants traveling long distances feared bandits, so instead of carrying gold, they could deposit it with the Templars in one city and withdraw the same amount somewhere else using a written note. Ingenious, right? Not bad for an order that claimed to live in poverty. Of course, the Templars charged service fees. They loaned money to monarchs, funded crusades, and even safeguarded royal treasures. King Richard the Lionheart borrowed heavily from them to fund his campaigns, and even the Pope used their banking services. With that kind of financial control, it was only a matter of time before kings began to feel threatened. One ruler in particular could not resist the temptation. King Philip IV of France owed the Templars enormous sums that he had no hope of repaying. Philip had already seized Jewish property to refill his treasury, and the Templars were his next target. He envied their wealth and hated their independence. Adding to his suspicion, the Templars operated behind closed doors, held private rituals, and answered only to the Pope. In a time when people saw secrecy as proof of evil, that kind of behavior fueled dark rumors. Whispers spread that the Templars worshipped demons, spat on the cross, and kissed each other as part of secret ceremonies. Philip decided to strike before his debts crushed him. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, he ordered a massive coordinated raid across France. Soldiers stormed Templar commanderies at dawn, arresting hundreds of knights in a single morning. The accusations were outrageous. Heresy, idol worship, and obscene initiation practices filled the list of crimes. Under torture, some broken men confessed to anything their captors demanded. Others held firm and died under questioning. Grand Master Jacques de Molay himself was tortured into confessing, but later withdrew his statement in public, refusing to die a liar. It was too late. The Templars' reputation was shattered. Seeing an opportunity to seize lands and treasures, other European rulers followed France's lead and began their own arrests. The Pope, pressured by Philip and unsure whom to trust, finally disbanded the order in 1312. 2 years later, de Molay and several high-ranking knights were burned alive in Paris. Witnesses claimed de Molay shouted a curse from the flames, calling on God to judge both the king and the pope within a year. Strangely enough, both men died soon afterward. Coincidence or divine revenge? No one knows, but the story endured for centuries. The remaining Templars disappeared into history. Some joined other knightly orders, while others simply went back to ordinary life. Their immense riches were swallowed by kings and princes across Europe. Thus ended the most famous brotherhood of the Middle Ages, destroyed not by foreign enemies, but by greed, envy, and political betrayal.